Brace yourself.
In recent years, there's been a large drive to flesh out the narrative potential that the video game medium possesses. Older technology is no longer constraining the opportunity to give video games the same kind of artistic proficiency as books, film, or music. Story matters quite a bit nowadays, much more than it did in the earliest years of video games. But at the same time, storytelling is opening a whole new can of worms for the game medium to endure. Some narrative-driven titles neglect the player's place in the matter entirely, denying them of the agency native to the gaming medium as a whole. It's becoming a balancing act, one so delicate that finding equilibrium can feel impossible. But that synergy is no pipe dream. There are games that can compensate for both sides of the fence, and today I'd like to talk about one of them. Danganronpa Trigger Happy Havoc for the PlayStation Vita. The Danganronpa series has been around for more than 5 years, going as far back as the PSP, but it wasn't until 2014 that the series got localized outside of Japan. The Vita version of Trigger Happy Havoc was released in North America and Europe in 2014, finally giving the series a chance in Western territories. The game's mixture of visual novel elements with courtroom trials was an unusual but ultimately praised design choice, and the series earned itself a cult following quickly. Trigger Happy Havoc's success also led to the game's sequel being released on Western Vitas that same year, with PC ports of both games getting released in 2016. The story-driven series was certainly bizarre, and it still retains a level of mechanical simplicity due to its visual novel elements, but thanks to a deep reserve of style and humor, Trigger Happy Havoc got more attention than anyone could have really predicted. So before diving in, let me first state today's thesis. Danganronpa merges its narrative with its story by incentivizing character interaction, making the characters into fundamental components to the game's design.
I'm getting tired of waiting. What say we just get started,
Danganronpa takes place at Hope's Peak Academy, a high school with a reputation of graduating some of the best minds in the world. Its intimidatingly high standards only allow the best of the best to attend. The player takes on the role of Makoto Naegi, a teen who gets admitted to Hope's Peak despite him being such an enormously average person. After stepping into Hope's Peak, Makoto and the player are introduced to the other select students, each with a special ability giving them the ultimate status needed to earn admission. But the pleasantries quickly disappear as Makoto and the others fall into a deep trance and awaken imprisoned inside Hope's Peak. Enter Monokuma, an eerily cheerful bear who details that the students are locked within Hope's Peak against their will. The only way out is to play Monokuma's killing game. If one student can murder another and evade conviction through the class trial, they can graduate, while all other students are executed. If the killer is detected, then only the killer is executed. With suspicions high and tension growing, Makoto and the other students must explore Hope's Peak Academy and discover the secret behind their imprisonment, all while avoiding being murdered by one of their fellow classmates. Danganronpa's setting is immediately hostile. The enclosed location and omniscient security watch from Monokuma make the school feel claustrophobic. It's a 1984 level of surveillance that doesn't waste time in making the characters and the player feel anxious, infecting the ecosystem the characters are forced to endure. This comes to a head once a character is assassinated, and the murder investigation segment begins. The player is then required to explore different parts of Hope's Peak Academy, searching for clues and inquiring for witness accounts. Once the evidence is collected, the trial portion of Danganronpa begins. By mixing elements of Phoenix Wright and even a little bit of arcade shooting, the trials are challenges to reveal character truths and unmask contradictions. It's at these trials where the player must face the fragile trust of Makoto's classmates, while also discovering personality and history elements that can change entire characters' reputations. During the trials, Danganronpa's mastery of character design is on full display. The trials magnify the tiniest details of a character's personality, the minute bits that would otherwise be easily overlooked. The player must then use those details as components to solutions, ultimately revealing the identity of the murderer. But Danganronpa manages to successfully merge its narrative and gameplay into an extremely cohesive whole. Many other games have made attempts to dodge ludonarrative dissonance, but despite best efforts, the unity rarely congeals into something seamless. Telling a story while reaffirming a player's place in the gameplay is not easy, and the games where the story and gameplay are perfectly synced are extremely rare. But there are successes. For example, Telltale's The Walking Dead has the permanence of results and ambiguity of player choice to form agency for the player, all while providing a brilliantly dynamic and borderline terrifying story to tell. Persona 4 is another good example of this phenomenon, as the game's social link mechanic encourages getting to know the various characters around town, while at the same time providing tangible advantages through extra persona to develop and skills to improve. Both The Walking Dead and Persona 4 provide explicit incentive for the player to explore their worlds, incentive that the player themselves can implement. But that's not to say these situations totally unite story and gameplay. The Walking Dead is really an illusion in player choice. Some story events are underdeveloped or simply don't have enough screen time to justify learning about them. This can leave some actions in The Walking Dead feeling empty and purposeless, shedding the player incentive and isolating the lesser characters from the design altogether. Similarly, Persona 4's social links are actually rather extraneous, despite their gameplay rewards. Depending on who you decide to interact with, you could get an enhancement in skills that you might not need, or talk to a character that doesn't matter much to the overarching story at all. Persona 4's gameplay incentives are not all required to progress in the story, so their optional nature makes their connection to the narrative feel weaker in that respect. But Danganronpa doesn't fall for these same traps. It manages to make its design and narrative integral to each other by implementing a single philosophy. The key to its seamless combination of narrative and gameplay is actually quite simple. It's the cast. Danganronpa's cast, at first glance, draws from many common character stereotypes. The fashionista, the biker thug, the comic nerd, the ditzy athlete, the shy writer, etc. It runs the gambit of every kind of character trope you'd expect in an anime or comic book. However, these tropes are an immediate red herring, as the characters you encounter throughout the story are in no way static. These characters change over the course of the game, personalities shift, and trust contorts. Already, this is an exceptional way to present a story. The diversity of the characters does so much to rock the boat, spiraling around the initial impressions and making even the simplest of tropes feel fragile and vulnerable to change. Talking with students during free time segments reveals quirks that might not have been apparent if you simply rushed to the end of the game. And even the smallest bits of flavor text can provide extensive importance to the gameplay. Danganronpa is not afraid to push even the most stagnant of personalities over the edge, and thanks to this malleability, it makes it difficult to fully trust your own judgment of them. Nothing is on stable ground at Hope's Peak Academy. But that is what makes the trial portions of the game so interesting. The different characters are put under the knife, where slight differences become glaring errors. Every single character in Danganronpa is flawed, and the murder mystery events only serve to make these flaws immediately noticeable. Monokuma as a villain cuts no corners in making every character in the game appear unappealing, or at the very least unable to be completely trusted. Because of the circumstances of the setting, learning about the characters doesn't just provide gameplay advantages, but they're required to succeed in the trials. The characters' accounts, their dialogue, their history, or even something as simple as their appearance or mannerisms become solutions to puzzles. Because that's exactly what the trials are, puzzles. The solution is knowing which student is guilty, and the only way to know is to understand not just who and how they did it, but also why they would. This is also amplified by the conditions of the story itself, imprisonment within Hope's Peak Academy. Because of having the school on lockdown, the pool of suspects for each case is narrowed down to only the students themselves. In fact, this is Monokuma's plan, to contain the students and force them to kill each other. Because of the school being cut off from the outside world, you're forced to interact with the same group of people throughout the game. This is an extremely intelligent design choice. Through containment and isolation, Danganronpa implicitly highlights the main cast specifically and always keeps the spotlight on them. At the same time, Monokuma's position in Danganronpa is of importance as well. As the mind behind the killing game, the bear creates a collection of rules that the students must follow, further containing and manipulating them. With his rules, Monokuma acts not just as a source of suffocating order, but also an instigator of suspicion. The killing game is meant to divide. It's meant to create a paranoia amongst the students, dissolving their trust of one another and making them hesitant to communicate and work together. But that's not what the player is supposed to do in Trigger Happy Havoc. The The entire point of the characters is to be sources of information to solve the mysteries, to understand character motives and skills, and to develop trust. Monokuma, with all of his tricks and traps, is out to impede that goal. He doesn't want the characters to trust each other. He wants them to constantly suspect malice from the other students. In that regard, Monokuma isn't just the enemy of the students at Hope's Peak. He's the enemy of the player themselves. When all of this comes together, Danganronpa strikes a powerful balance. It uses its cast as components of game design. It incentivizes learning about them and their personalities. But it also uses its setting as a boundary. Because of Hope's Peak being locked and Monokuma always watching, the puzzles in Danganronpa are self-contained and the rulings are preserved. It's a form of centralization that directs the player toward interacting with the only NPCs they can find, the students, all while evading influence from Monokuma, whose purpose is to keep them divided. Overall, if I had to describe Danganronpa in one word, it would be calculated. Danganronpa is shockingly calculated. It's purely conscientious in what is required for a murder mystery to operate, but it's also creative enough to make the participating characters into dynamic entities. The entire world of Danganronpa is self-contained alongside its own rules, abandoning extraneous distractions and giving full attention to its diverse and charismatic cast. That kind of attention is preserved during the trials, as characters become crucial to giving each puzzle a valid solution. Determining the killer requires the player to know their classmates, and to use that knowledge to make accurate verdicts. For a game that borders on sadistic whimsy and perpetual paranoia, Danganronpa is actually very cool-headed. Its structure demands interaction between Makoto and the other students, and in knowing that, Spike Chunsoft managed to do something very few developers can do: make characters essential to both the story and game design. If a game is to triumphantly tote an interesting story, all while preserving the player's sense of agency and purpose throughout, it needs to approach the task with the same sky-high level of calculation that Danganronpa does, because Spike Chunsoft has set the bar quite high.